The camera fades in on a sleek, glass-walled office high above the city skyline. The golden glow of the setting sun reflects off the windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. A man in his early 40s, dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, stands near the window, hands in his pockets, eyes distant. This is Ethan Carter, billionaire tech mogul, founder of VentureX, the world's leading AI and robotics company. To the outside world, he's a genius, a visionary, untouchable. But inside, there's an exhaustion in his gaze, a quiet longing for something more than boardrooms, profit margins, and never-ending expansion. The world worships men like him, but it also despises them. A single news article is plastered on his office screen. Tech billionaire exploits workers, while profits skyrocket. The comments are even worse. Greedy rich scum. People like him don't care about the little guy. He'll never understand what it's like to struggle. Ethan exhales, rubbing his jaw. He built this empire from nothing. But somewhere along the way, he became the villain in everyone's story. Maybe in some ways, they're right. Down in the bustling heart of the company, far removed from Ethan's penthouse office, Sophie Mitchell slams her laptop shut. She's in her mid-20s, sharp-eyed, quick-witted, and exhausted from pulling yet another late night in the development department. The corporate world wasn't kind to people like her, young, ambitious, but without the right connections, and especially not kind to those who spoke their mind. She wasn't afraid to call out VentureX's leadership for prioritizing profits over people, and if that meant ranting about it in every lunch break, so be it. They don't care about us, Sophie mutters to her coworker, shoving her phone into her bag. Billionaires sit in their glass towers while we break our backs, making them richer. Her coworker sighs. Careful, Sophie. One day, someone's going to hear you. What neither of them know is that someone already has, because Ethan has decided to do something unthinkable. The next morning, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting button-up and cheap sneakers steps into VentureX's intern orientation. His name tag reads Cass Ethan C. Just another entry-level intern among dozens of fresh recruits. Gone are the tailored suits, the luxury watches. His hair is unkempt, his demeanor unsure. No one recognizes him. And that's exactly what he wants. For the first time in decades, Ethan Carter is about to see his empire from the ground level. And then there's Sophie. From the moment she meets the new intern, something about him seems off. He's awkward, asks way too many questions, and sometimes slips up in ways that don't make sense. But the real problem, she actually likes talking to him. He listens. He cares. He understands the struggles of the employees in a way no one else seems to. And that terrifies her. Because the last thing she needs is to get close to someone, especially not someone like him. What she doesn't know is that the man she's slowly letting her guard down around is the one she swore she hated the most. And what Ethan doesn't know is that this journey is going to change everything. His company, his beliefs, and most of all, his heart. But the truth can't stay hidden forever. And when Sophie finds out who he really is, will she ever forgive him? Or will the walls she's built around her heart be stronger than anything even a billionaire can break? This is where the real story begins. Stay tuned. Ethan had never felt so out of place in his own company. The office floor, usually something he only saw from the boardroom screens, now felt massive and overwhelming. No one looked twice at him as he settled into a tiny desk in the corner. His computer outdated, the chair slightly wobbly. He had built this empire. Yet here he was, just another face in a sea of employees, trying to blend in. Sophie, however, noticed everything. At first, it was just small things. The way he fumbled with the office coffee machine, like he had never made a cup for himself before. How he typed slowly, as if he wasn't used to doing it for hours at a time. And then there was the way he asked questions. Curious, detailed, almost too invested. He wasn't like the other interns, most of whom were college kids, just happy to have a foot in the door. He was older, sharper, but also strangely clueless about things a normal intern would already know. And then there was the way he listened. At first, it was just small things. The way he fumbled with the office coffee machine, like he had never made a cup for himself before. How he typed slowly, as if he wasn't used to doing it for hours at a time. And then there was the way he asked questions, curious, detailed, almost too invested. He wasn't like the other interns, most of whom were college kids, just happy to have a foot in the door. He was older, sharper, but also strangely clueless about things a normal intern would already know. And then there was the way he listened. Ethan quickly realized how different life was down here. Employees weren't just complaining for no reason. They were overworked, underpaid, and constantly worried about deadlines that seemed impossible to meet. He saw firsthand how Sophie barely had time for a lunch break, how she and her team were pushed to finish projects at an unrealistic speed, only to be told to do better when things weren't perfect. He started to see the frustration, the exhaustion, things he had been blind to for years. But Sophie, she was different. She didn't just accept things the way they were. She challenged everything. She fought back, pushing for fair treatment, refusing to be silenced, even when it meant risking her job. And despite himself, Ethan found that he admired her. Maybe a little more than he should. The more time they spent together, the more their conversations shifted from work to personal things. Ethan learned that Sophie had dropped out of college to support her younger brother, working long hours to keep them both afloat. She had big dreams, ones that felt impossible in a world where people like Ethan Carter held all the power, and she hated him for that. Or at least, she thought she did. Because as much as she tried to keep her distance, there was something about the new intern that made her let her guard down. He wasn't like the others. He saw her, really saw her, and, for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt like she wasn't fighting alone. But the lie was getting harder to keep. Ethan was in too deep. He had started this as a way to understand his company, to see the truth with his own eyes. But now it wasn't just about business. It was about Sophie, about the way her eyes lit up when she talked about the future, about how fiercely she protected the people around her. He knew that when she found out who he really was, everything would fall apart, and then it happened. Sophie wasn't supposed to be in the executive wing, but a last-minute IT issue had sent her upstairs, straight into the lion's den. She wasn't expecting to see anything unusual until she passed by the CEO's office and saw a familiar face on the giant screen. Ethan Carter, her Ethan. Her stomach dropped. It had to be a mistake. Maybe it was someone who just looked like him. Maybe. But then she saw the picture. Ethan Carter, standing in front of a VentureX logo, shaking hands with investors. Same face, same eyes, the same ones that had looked at her like she mattered. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. He had lied to her. The next morning, when Ethan walked into the office, he knew something was wrong. Sophie wasn't at her desk. Her usual coffee cup sat untouched, and then he saw the email. Tia all employees. Subject: The truth about Ethan Carter. He felt the blood drain from his face. By the time he found her, the damage had already been done. The entire office was buzzing with whispers. People stared, some in shock, others in anger. Sophie stood in the break room, arms crossed, waiting. "So," she said, voice cold, "how long were you planning to keep up the act?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had prepared for a lot of things, but not this, not the look of betrayal in her eyes. "You really had me fooled," she continued, shaking her head. "I actually thought—" She cut herself off, biting her lip. "You know what? It doesn't matter, because now everyone knows exactly who you are." Ethan took a step closer. "Sophie, I didn't do this to hurt you. I needed to see the truth for myself." She let out a bitter laugh. "And what? You thought playing pretend would fix everything? That you'd swoop in, have your little experiment, and then what? Go back to your penthouse while we keep struggling? It's not like that," Ethan said quietly. "Then what is it like?" she demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, you're just another billionaire who thinks he can play with people's lives." The words cut deeper than he expected. Because the worst part, she was right. Before he could say another word, Sophie turned and walked away. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Carter had no idea how to fix what he had broken. Ethan stood frozen as Sophie walked away, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. He had spent his life fixing problems, companies, systems, profits. But this wasn't something he could solve with a strategy or a check. This was different. This was real. And for the first time, he understood just how much he had lost touch with the people who actually built his empire. The fallout spread fast. Employees were furious, feeling deceived. Some were shocked. Others resigned to the idea that the rich would always manipulate their way through life. Sophie, once the loudest voice in the office, now refused to speak to him at all. Ethan wanted to explain, but what could he say? That he hadn't meant to betray them. That he had only wanted to understand. It didn't matter. His actions had already hurt people. Days passed, then weeks. The office tension was thick. Ethan stopped trying to approach Sophie, knowing she wasn't ready to hear anything from him. Instead, he did what he should have done from the start. He listened, really listened. He sat with employees in meetings, not as their boss, but as someone who wanted to change things. He saw how the company had been running on fear of layoffs, impossible deadlines, and being seen as replaceable. And he realized that the system he had created was broken. But one realization stood out above all. Sophie was right. He had been playing pretend. So he did something no one expected. One morning, an email landed in every employee's inbox. This time, it wasn't an announcement about record profits or a new expansion. It was an apology, a real one. He admitted everything: the disguise, the deception, the privilege that had blinded him. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to justify it. Instead, he outlined real changes: better pay, fairer hours, and more transparency between leadership and employees. He promised to step back from the shadows of wealth and actually lead with the people who worked for him, not above them. And then he did the hardest thing. He left the decision in their hands. If the employees didn't believe in him, if they wanted him gone, he would resign. No loopholes, no negotiations. The response was mixed. Some still didn't trust him. Others saw it as a step forward. But there was only one person whose reaction mattered most to Ethan: Sophie. He found her on the rooftop, staring out over the city. She didn't turn when he walked up beside her. The silence stretched between them. You're really willing to walk away from your own company? She finally asked. If that's what it takes, Ethan said quietly. Sophie exhaled, shaking her head. You really don't get it, do you? Ethan frowned. What do you mean? She turned to him, arms crossed. You think the problem is just you, that if you step down, everything magically fixes itself. But it's bigger than that. It's the whole system. The way people like you hold all the power while the rest of us just try to survive. I know, Ethan admitted, and I don't have all the answers, but I want to do better. I will do better. He hesitated before adding, I don't want to be another billionaire who doesn't care, and I don't want to be someone you hate. Sophie's expression softened, just a little. I don't hate you, Ethan, she said. I hate what people like you represent. He nodded, understanding. Then help me change that. For the first time in weeks, Sophie didn't pull away. She studied him, searching for any trace of dishonesty, but all she found was a man who had finally learned what it meant to truly see the world beyond his own. All right, she said, but you don't get a free pass. You have to prove it. Ethan smiled, something real and unguarded. I wouldn't expect anything less, and for the first time, the space between them didn't feel like a war. It felt like the start of something new.